It's week 11 of the Bible Challenge. You are more than 1/5 of the way through the Bible. More than 20%. And in the year in which we're starting this, 2016, if you're following this chronologically, we're now right in the middle of Lent and getting on the downslope through Lent as we move rapidly towards Holy Week and Easter. We are going to finish most of Deuteronomy this week, and most of Luke. We'll continue through the Psalms, starting at Psalm 59. But in Deuteronomy this week, we start at chapter 19. And here's where we get more laws. And as we spoke last week, when we speak of a holiness code, we need to think of sort of two dimensions to the law. One is, how do we relate to God? And this is both at an individual level and at a collective level, because Moses is speaking for God to the people as a collective, the people. But we also read this as individuals because of the horizontal dimension, which is, how do we relate to each other? The basic point here is that in the law, or indeed in the very architecture of the cross, if the vertical dimension, our relationship with God, is out of balance, the horizontal dimension, our relationship with each other, is going to be out of balance as well, and vice versa. So the holiness code is all about right relationship, how we stay in right relationship with God and with each other. And a lot of the laws here are going to come across in your reading as quite ancient. They are. They are written many centuries ago in a pastoral society in the Middle East. We don't live in 21st century America in a pastoral, strictly patriarchal society. A lot of this seems foreign because it is. Our challenge is to go through a lot of what is foreign and identify what is speaking to us now, despite our change in circumstance. So we start out here. And first we see a little evolution in ancient law. In chapter 19 we get laws relating to homicide. But there are exceptions to the strict lex talionis, or life for life, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Because we get this specification of 3 cities of refuge, safe havens from retribution. In other words, if you can make it to this city of retribution, the next of kin, the defender of the blood, can't come and just kill you. You're now safe. This is actually the origin of the medieval status of a church as a sanctuary. This was the scriptural warrant for church sanctuary. We also get references to sanctuary at Exodus 21:13, 1 Kings 1:51, and 2:28. The distinction is made here as well in chapter 19 between intentional and unintentional killing. It's basically a clarification of some of what was revealed in Exodus 21. The Avenger of Blood is the formal title here for the one who's going to come after the murderer. This is not a public official. This is the next of kin. And the Avenger of Blood's duty, in effect, is not optional. Now, we still see this sort of honor-killing system at work in a lot of the world today. But we're going to see that in the law of Israel and in the law of Christ, there will be a significant evolution from that. When we get to chapter 20, 21, the Lord is described as a warrior God in the rules relating to the conduct of war. In other words, the Lord fights for his people. And the flip side of that, though, is that it's not unlimited warfare, because regulations are specified for the treatment of prisoners of war. You can't just kill them all, can't just enslave them all. There are limits here, and it's because of who God is as a God of both justice and mercy. We get a whole series of miscellaneous laws relating to lost property, followed by humanitarian and cultic laws. What do I mean by cultic laws? Well, cultic laws, let's go back to humanitarian laws. This relates to, what do you do when somebody's in need? Can you just ignore them? And the message, even in the law of Moses, is no, you can't. You have duties to them. This is going to be amplified very specifically by Jesus. And this is a revolutionary view in the history of human beings, that we don't just take a utilitarian view toward others, that we don't just treat others as objects. The concept of personhood that is so important to all modern thought and law finds its origin in the Jewish and Christian worldview. Before that, you're an interchangeable commodity. And there are still cultures where people can be interchangeable commodities. But if we have duties at a humanitarian level, it's because of the fact that each person is created in the image and likeness of God. Now, because of that, the worldview of the law, which is specified here, is that a human being, each individual, has a unique personal interest and a personal relationship with God. And as I said, this is a revolution in worldview. It is the revolution upon which all humanitarian considerations arise and are treated, in fact, as holy. The corollary is that individual as opposed to corporate responsibility is the principle of divine justice. And we're going to see that at Jeremiah 31:29, Ezekiel 18:5 to 18, for example. We don't hold individuals at fault for what other people have done. Is an evolution in worldview. When we talk about cultic laws, what are we talking about? Well, here again, the holiness code that we've talked about throughout this is not designed to say, how do you get into right relationship with God, but how do you keep that relationship healthy? How do you practice the cult of the worship of the Lord so that things that are unworthy, unclean, don't come into that? Throughout Numbers, for example, we saw that those who didn't stay pure ended up being destroyed. So this is designed to be sort of a sanitary code, for lack of a better word to say. If you go outside these boundaries, you'll be polluted and your relationship with God will be destroyed. In chapter 26, we get from verses 5 to 11 what amounts to an Israelite credo or creed. Now, I spoke about back in chapter 6 when we got that first great commandment, Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one, and it goes on and states who the Lord is in relationship to Israel. Here, now we talk about ourselves as the Israelites, and we go to chapter 26. I'm not going to read it all here, but it starts out and it says, A wandering Aramean was my father, and he went down into Egypt and sojourned there, few in number, and there he became a great nation. And it goes on and recites the history of the Israelites and how they are God's chosen people, how he has called them and brought them out of Egypt. So the credo here is very much about identity in relationship with God. The Christian creed takes a different approach. It's about who God is. The Jewish creed is about who the people are because of who God is. This recitation of faith is deemed complete only upon the payment of a tithe. And so you say who you are in relationship to God, not just as a statement of mental assent, but in terms of what you do. You actually pay a tithe into the temple treasury. Well, this is before the temple, but you pay a tithe into the Lord's cult. The conclusion continues in the form of an address of Moses, which includes blessings and curses. Blessings and curses are made as definitive statements of the law in the form of a testament. The blessings and curses are first stated about acts, and then about the status of the people in their lives in the community. Curses climax in the experience of defeat and exile, which we see in chapter 28, which is evidence of Deuteronomy being written and edited at a much later date than in Moses' lifetime. We get a recitation here of a threefold acknowledgement of the law as a reciprocal covenant, 26:16 through 19. This day is said 3 times. This is reciprocal. And the causative of the verb here is amar. This is you have declared. This is a technical sense of acknowledging a statement as legally binding. It's just kind of like saying, well, you signed here, and we have witnesses. The covenant is officially renewed in chapter 29. This reflects God's fidelity, which is recited in chapter 30. And famously, the people are here exhorted to observe the law as attainable and to choose life. That's chapter 30, verse 15. In the observance of God's commandments. In other words, the law is attainable. You don't have to go up to heaven. You don't have to go down to Sheol. The law is present to you. You can do this, is the message of chapter 30. And then there's an exhortation. Choose to do this. Choose to be in right relationship with the Lord. You are choosing life rather than death. Partial reflection there as well of the ancient wisdom literature tradition that there are 2 ways to live. We talked about this in the context of Psalm 1, that you can follow the Lord's pathway, and that's the pathway of wisdom, or you can follow your own, and that's the pathway of folly. Moses in chapter 31 starts out here, his last will and testament in effect, with the commissioning of Joshua, and then Deuteronomy switches form into verse. The Song of Moses shows up in chapter 32, probably a later addition echoing earlier themes from the Elohist source. The blessings which Moses recites in 33 are blessings of particular tribes. And the blessing of the tribe of Joseph here indicates an origin of the northern kingdom not later than the 8th century before Christ. We get this odd reference at 33:8 to Urim and Thummim. This is some kind of oracular device. It's not really described. Probably something like dice, but a way of casting lots and seeing if God's will can be divine. Moses' death is referred to in chapter 34, probably from a priestly source in the document. We can compare this in chapter 27 in Numbers. In chapter 27 in Numbers, where Joshua is appointed because he possesses spirit, here the spirit of wisdom, and therefore the ability to rule, is conferred by the laying on of hands. So we see an early example, in effect, of what will become an ordination rite. And that's where we end up Deuteronomy this week. Now the Psalms, we're going to go from Psalm 59 through 64 this week. Again, we're looking at very similar forms of Psalms. 59 being an individual lament, probably royal, probably a cry for deliverance from besieging enemies. 60, a communal lament, probably following a military defeat. And in response to the people's plea for an answer from God, God asserts his supremacy not only over Israel's enemies, but over Israel and Judah. 61 is another individual lament, which assumes a royal character on the basis of its plea for the king. In verse 2 we get a reference to the ends of the earth, and we can also translate the Hebrew here as from the brink of the nether world. So the reference in the following verse, verse 3, to the enemy is probably a reference to the final enemy, death. And therefore the movement in the psalm from the presence of death to the presence of God is a reference to salvation, not just to victory in a temporal sense. Psalm 62, we switch gears. We get a classic psalm of trust. The psalmist is reciting his own trust in God and invites the community to do likewise. 63 is as well a psalm of trust, albeit with some other sort of obscure elements thrown in. The parallel elements in verses 3 to 5 of lips responding to God indicates that there's a formal prayer going on here. remember, we're at a point in time where we don't formally have an afterlife. We're not worried about going to heaven or hell. At best, there's this idea of some kind of netherworld. And so life is prized above all other things. And therefore, the reference in verse 3 to God's love being better than life itself is both powerful and unique in all of the Old Testament. So that verse is something that we should pay attention to. It is an insight that foreshadows the understanding of God's love being extended beyond death that we're going to see Paul talk about at Romans chapter 8, verses 38 and 39. Psalm 64, we have another individual lament. The parallel here reflects divine justice, that those who shoot arrows at the psalmist will be targeted by the arrow of God. This echoes the old theme that vengeance is the Lord's, not the individual's. Now, in Luke, we are moving forward from a lot of teachings about what discipleship means, what the cost of discipleship is. Jesus is now on his way to Jerusalem. He's going to the cross. This is being made clear. We have just had an extravagant example of God's mercy back in chapter 15 in the prodigal son. And the teachings here are now focused on how the disciples are renewed inwardly. We get a stern warning issued to the disciples not to cause their brothers or sisters to abandon their pilgrimage. Don't put anything in the way of your brother or sister. As Jesus here in chapter 17 enters the last leg of his journey to Jerusalem, he instructs his disciples in what it means to follow him. Here we get this encounter with the lepers, 10 lepers. And Jesus heals the lepers, and only the Samaritan leper turns back to offer thanks. Again, an example here of Luke calling out how the outsider, foreigner, is the one who responds to God. Samaritans are ultimate outsiders. We're going to see that in the parable of the Good Samaritan, because these are descendants of people who've basically been imported by the Greek rulers who tried to overthrow Judaism in the centuries before Jesus, when Alexander the Great's armies, well, Alexander the Great died in the year 323 BC in Afghanistan, what is now Afghanistan, and his generals formed their own kingdoms. These became known as the Seleucid dynasties, or the Ptolemies. One of them, this is the account that shows up in the books of the Maccabees, one of them decided that the way to deal with the Jews was to break the Jewish cult. So he sacrificed a pig on the altar in the temple. Probably what Daniel is talking about as the desolating sacrilege, probably what Jesus is talking about as the desolating sacrilege. We get the first Jewish war there against the Ptolemies. In the case here of the Samaritans, though, the other thing that this Greek king, whose name was Antiochus Epiphanes IV, did was he imported foreigners and had them populate the area, and they became the Samaritans. They came from northeastern Iraq, what is now northeastern Iraq. We can think of them as peoples that eventually end up as Kurds or Yazidis. And they are people who follow a lot of Jewish practice but are considered by the Jews of Jesus' time to be dirty foreigners. So when it's the Samaritan who helps the man in the parable of the Good Samaritan, Jesus' listeners are pricking up their ears. When the Samaritan turns back in the healing of the lepers, they're pricking up their ears as well. But Luke does something else here that's interesting. And it relates to the word that he uses. He describes the Samaritan as seeing Jesus using a word in Greek, eidon, which is not the same word as just to look upon, blepo. I can blepo you, I can blepo this camera sitting in front of me and say, I see it, it is within my visual field. If the word eidon is used here, idao, then I would be perceiving or sensing or experiencing or understanding. Hopefully not the camera. But the Samaritan recognizes who Jesus is. He doesn't just see who he is, this man, this wonder worker standing in front of him. He recognizes who he is, and so we are to understand that there are no boundaries of nationality that are recognized by God. This point is emphasized in Luke recording Jesus as saying to the leper, "Your faith has saved you." The response is one of faith, not of identity. We get a series of exhortations to faith following this. Disciples are to have faith throughout the end times that Jesus describes. And notably here, the Pharisees are unable to see the end times, the coming of the kingdom of God in Jesus' cleansing of the lepers. So we're getting that contrast again between blepoing something and whether an eidon is present, whether we are sensing and understanding or whether we're just looking upon something. Now, Luke, we get another series of parables here. We get the widow and the unjust judge, the Pharisee and the tax collector, the rich ruler, and these are all tied into the coming of the Messiah. The faithful must remain faithful despite end times. In other words, pray and keep praying. Pray and keep praying. Bug God about things. The Pharisee and the tax collector. Don't sit there and think because of your status and what you've done right that you are in better relationship to one who literally abases himself before God and says, "There's nothing I can do to repair my relationship with you, Lord, except turn to you and trust in the fact that you will repair it, you will have mercy." Jesus, in this context, again predicts his own passion. So again, it's going to be up to God to fix what's wrong in creation. And we get this followed by examples of ministry to outcasts, for example, to a blind man at the end of chapter 18. Then we get another outcast, the tax collector Zacchaeus. Now the story is unique to Luke. It doesn't show up in the other synoptic gospels. And the point is reinforced by the tax collector's name, Zacchaeus, which is a Greek name, meaning clean one. Tax collectors are real outcasts here. How can they be clean? He's the one, however, who responds readily to God's call, demonstrating that it is God who saves, not humankind. A tax collector's a rich man, but with God all things are possible. And so a rich man does get through the needle's eye, and this salvation extends to all of his household. And so we get this reinforced in the parable of the 10 talents in chapter 19, when it's made clear that disciples have to take risks in following Jesus. We're not to be passive and just bury the talent in the ground, bury God's gift in the ground. Predictably, Jesus is rejected in Jerusalem. Now, Luke closely follows Mark in this section of the narrative. The narrative includes a triumphal entry, a lament over Jerusalem, the cleansing of the temple, challenges to Jesus' authority, which are answered with a parable, that of the wicked tenants and the vineyard, and a denunciation of the scribes. And they get it. When Jesus tells the parable of the wicked tenants, the temple authorities understand who he's talking about. Jesus takes possession of the temple and is himself the temple. When he cleanses the temple with cords, he embodies God's presence. He affirms his authority to speak for God and teaches God's way. In answering the famous question about paying taxes to Caesar, Jesus is not speaking about civil authority, but about its limits. The coin he would have been shown would have borne the inscription, "Tiberius Caesar, son of the divine Augustus, great high priest." And Jesus is making the point more about idolatry than about taxes here. Whose likeness is this? Render unto God that which is God's. When Jesus in chapter 21 praises the widow for giving her all for the support of the temple, the so-called widow's mite, Jesus is also condemning the religious teaching that would have the widow give to support a decaying institution. So if we wanted to preach a whole bunch of stewardship sermons, and all our stewardship sermons were about how we needed to maintain the church and keep doing what we're doing now and fix the roof and fix the heating plant, and it was all about how we do things, we would be condemned by this teaching, because what the church is supposed to be about is not maintaining a particular model. It's about mission, reaching out to those who do not know God. And we have to look at whatever we do, whatever model it might be, in the context of how does it support the mission of the church. If it doesn't, it has to change. Scary thought. That change word really freaks Episcopalians out. Now, in chapter 21, we also get Jesus foretelling the destruction of the temple in the verses right after he's condemned support for a decaying institution. So, we should pay close attention here if we're focused on the institution rather than the mission. This prophecy of the destruction of the temple precedes a series of teachings about end times and the need to watch. It's immediately followed by public confrontations, Jesus and his disciples, and the plot to hatch Jesus gets hatched. Again, Luke is following Mark closely here, but his theology is a little bit different. His narrative is following Mark, but his theology is more one of Jesus' association with sinners being woven throughout this Markan narrative. In other words, those who inherit the kingdom aren't going to be necessarily who we might expect. It's up to God. Jesus starts his farewell discourse here in chapter 22 by sending Peter and John to secure the room for their last meal. And Peter and John, who will be leaders of the church, obey their master's command, in contrast to Judas, who in the same passage is described as having gone away. Jesus then institutes the Holy Eucharist as his legacy to the church. His farewell address parallels the form of farewell addresses we get from King David at 1 Kings chapter 2, Mattathias in 1 Maccabees chapter 2. Luke uses Jesus' farewell as an exhortation for his communities, his disciples, for how to prepare for Eucharist. Now, here we get into this idea of do this in remembrance of me. And the Greek word used is anamnesin, which is a different concept of memory. It's not about recalling things from time past to mind. Anamnesin literally means to make present again. And so when Jesus is gathered with his disciples, it's not just that he's having a meal. He's saying, do this. Take bread, take wine, bless, offer, gather, listen to my teaching, be with each other, make communion. He's being very explicit here. Luke, in the context of the Last Supper narrative here, refers to the hour has come. And this parallels the understanding we're going to see in John's Gospel about Jesus' hour. Jesus here says, take this, in referring to the Eucharist. Until his dying breath, Jesus is going to continue feeding his disciples. His reference to his body here at verse 19, it uses the word soma, which is a reference to being, in addition to a reference to flesh. So we're not just talking about meat here in terms of body. We're talking about incarnated body, soul within body, being within body. The new covenant in Jesus' blood here echoes the establishment of a bond between God and his people, which we saw back in Exodus 24 and also in Jeremiah 31 with the bond being written on the heart. Again, anamnesin, make me present again. The first part of Jesus' farewell address here therefore ends with the pouring out of his blood as the means of salvation. Now, when we get to Acts, we're going to be getting to the second volume of Luke's two-volume work. And the examples of leadership that we're going to see in Acts have to be viewed in the light of what happens at the Last Supper. Because Luke doesn't really follow Mark here. He places the betrayal of Jesus in the context of the Last Supper, not before it. We could contrast Mark 14:18 to 21 there. We get a dispute over greatness in this context. And the word in referring to those in charge is hegumenos, or hegemon. This is talking about a leader more in a temporal power sense. Luke, in fact, may be warning about church leaders here, because this is in the context of the Last Supper. And so the portrayal of Peter's failure places later leadership in the church in context. The leader leads as empowered by God, not on the basis of office, not on the basis of rank, but as empowered by God. Yes, we have a hierarchical church, and there are strengths in that, and I'm not going to argue otherwise. But we can point throughout history to people in hierarchical positions who are not leading as empowered by God, but because of the importance they attach to their own office. Luke might be making that point here in his portrayal of the Last Supper. When we get to the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus is faithful and the disciples are not. The failure of Peter is again contrasted with Jesus fulfilling the Father's will, and it is when Jesus is apparently powerless that he foretells God's vindication. Again, God's ways are not the ways of the world. The ways of the world would be for Jesus to push the button and have 12 legions of angels show up. He's making the point that he could do that, but that's not the way he, God, works. On that note, we'll end for this week. Next week, we'll start a new book in the Old Testament, the book of Joshua. We'll continue through the Psalms. We'll finish up Luke, and we'll begin in John's Gospel. God bless.